To keep body and soul together, working and earning, was the right thing to do.
In France, I mean, there's quite a number of entertainers, you know, Maurice Chevalier, Charles Trenet, they stayed there. And at the end of the war, people say, you're a brilliant collaborator because you just stayed.
I think quite often with these incredibly hard-working artists, they're not necessarily political. But it was obvious that if you wanted to carry on working in occupied Europe at that time, you had to toe the line.
Hergé produced 6 stories during the war, which avoided any controversy. Instead, he offered escapism through the adventures of Tintin.
The work that he did under the Nazis actually pushed him away from the political storylines he had been exploring and towards rather sort of lovely escapist fantasies, which are some of his most charming works, I think. They're the works that he produced in an extraordinary burst of creativity, and actually they're some of the most enduring, I think.
That's strange. I've never noticed that star before. I smell a story here. Come on, Snowy.
But what I love about it is it's Tintin expanding his horizons, and he's looking up to the stars, and it is about meteorites falling, and it kind of goes beyond the earthly confines, and yet it's still just a classic great Tintin adventure, and it's got boats, and it's got biplanes, and it's got kind of what would then have been the latest technology. It's just a really, really good story.
That's pure escapism, you know, and the authorities must have liked that.
Wow! Look at this! Now we're getting somewhere!
Crab with the golden claws. It just sounds like something from a Bond film. It's brilliant, before I was even aware of James Bond.
The war years also produced Tintin's most famous sidekicks, who would go on to become lifelong favourites.
The characters were just brilliant. Just brilliant. Everyone, like Snowy the dog and Captain Haddock.
They're all good because they've all got the essential elements. You can't do Tintin without Tintin and the quiff and the clothes and Snowy with the bone in his mouth and Captain Haddock with, you know, all those wonderful alliterative kind of phrases and insults.
Ah, here we go. My nose, billions of blistering barnacles. What a line.
And the great thing about what Hergé came up with is that he came up with a drunk to start with. It's a beauty, you know. Haddock is marvelous.
The Thompsons, to some degree, are kind of Lestrade. They're the bumbling cops that appear in, you know, in crime fiction pretty much throughout. And Calculus, who's that great, he's the, you know, the trust me, I'm a scientist figure. They're just such great stock characters that wherever they go in this world or out of it, you know, up into space or down into the seven seas, they're just great characters.
Tintin's sidekicks, although a welcome addition to the series, were unusual characters to have alongside the young Belgian hero.
They all seem to be almost like surrogate parents to him. Haddock, Calculus, the Thompson, they're old enough to be his parents.
And it allows him to move throughout the world without the encumbrances that adult characters have. So there's a certain innocence there as well, which is interesting.
Today, if Haddock was Tintin's dad, Tintin would be on the at-risk register because he'd be a terrible parent, taking him on these adventures and drinking the way he does and with the violence. So he's not aspiring to be like these adults, but he wants them in his world. So pretty much it's a dysfunctional setup, isn't it? Tintin's the only one really with any real credibility.
You always get the sense that Tintin is from a little place. He wouldn't work if he were British, which was the kind of dominant power of the time. It works because he's plucky little Tintin from plucky little Belgium, from this small place that doesn't have anybody famous except Tintin.
And then again, it could be a metaphor for Belgium. It's a small country, small young country, and it's surrounded by older, more powerful and dangerous countries.
When the war ended, Hergé's very survival meant that he was once again accused of being a Nazi collaborator.
At the end of the war, you have a lot of patriots coming out of the woodwork. They were in the resistance all along, that sort of thing. They want to find the guilty parties, the whiter than white, self-righteous characters. You emerge out of this dreadful thing with, well, actually no moral standing at all. Hergé was one, and he must have asked himself, well, could I have done this, could I have done that?
But he's a cartoon. It's not meant to be the real world. And I think it's only because he's such a believable character that you even start to do that. He's a line drawing with a quiff, and you have to remind yourself of that.
He was banned from newspapers for 2 years. Although the charges were unfounded, the stress pushed him to a nervous breakdown in 1947. Tintin was put on ice. When Hergé returned, he finished many of the books he had started during the war, which were still grounded in fantastic escapist adventures, featuring the new regulars of Haddock and Calculus.
A river! This is our only chance, Snowy!
This is probably my favourite of them all, partly because it's one of the ones that kind of acted almost like a travel brochure for me when I was younger. I thought one day I'm going to go to Peru.
When I was young, it gave me an interest in the world.
It's got that kind of yearning for new lands, and it's got Aztecs and Mayans, and it's got sacrifice, and it's a great adventure, and it's got all the perfect cliffhangers in it, and it's got spitting llamas, and it's got lots of humour, and I think this is one of the most terrific adventures that he has.
Again, it's the James Bond thing, the world is my office, and I think the way that he moves around the world as a free agent and mixes in all these cultures, he's always open-minded towards the cultures, and he's never closed off towards them. I think that's a post-Second World War, 20th century lifestyle. So I think he's a moderniser, and it certainly encouraged me to feel that I could move around the world with freedom.
For more than a year, Eniwetok, a lonely Pacific atoll, has kept a secret which these pictures reveal for the first time. This was Operation Greenhouse, an atomic explosion designed to show the devastating effect of the blast on fighting equipment and all types of buildings.
By the 1950s, the Cold War had set in, and the strained American and Soviet relationship put the world on edge.
Several months ago, we saw and heard our president announce a pair of unusual events in this day of Cold War tensions. He, as the leader of the West, would exchange visits with the leader of the East, Premier Khrushchev.
The threat of nuclear war was at the forefront of people's minds, and inspired Hergé to produce the Calculus Affair, which sees Professor Calculus develop a weapon of potential power.
Over the years, I have reread Calculus Affair, which is possibly my favorite. I think Hergé was great when he did international politics, and I think that beefs up his stories.
The Americans and the Soviets were also locked in a race to the moon, and over a decade before anyone would make the landing, Hergé transported Tintin to the moon in espionage classics.
Men had gone on to explore the realms beyond, into the dizzy heights of space, onward toward the planets. There lies the new course for brave men with wings. Up there is the everlasting monument to Wilbur and Orville Wright.
I was fascinated by the idea going to the moon, and suddenly the Soviets, the communists, are way ahead of us. And the notion was that they were technologically backward. And suddenly they're there. They put the first man up in orbit. They send the first craft to hit the moon, to go around the moon. The Americans were absolutely, yeah, and the rest of the Western world. It's kind of a so. Hergé didn't have this as a trigger. I think he just that was a normal thing to do, you know. Send Tintin to the moon.
The stories came 16 years before the actual Apollo moon landings, and the technology was still being developed. But again, Hergé's research and attention to detail made the stories seem accurate.
For a long time, the moon was just about everything. It was at the limit of imagination. So why bother with galaxies and stars? You know, you could base a science fiction story within the moon's orbit, and it satisfied everybody's imagination.
I think there's something about the illustrations in it that just really captured my imagination, and something about the atmosphere of anticipation. It appealed to the childish imagination, I think.
I remember seeing the book on the shelves, and they cost money. They were not cheap at all. And I remember seeing these two books and drooling, you know. And it was years before I managed to read them. And the covers were really kind of mind-blowing. You know, this huge, a souped-up German rocket.
Yeah, I think he based the rocket on the German V2 rocket, didn't he? And he scrupulously researched it to get as much as he could. Hergé was always scrupulously accurate about the machines that Tintin encountered. It was one of the ways that he must have retained the interest of the boys who were reading the comics.
And I think that's the stories that really turned Tintin into an international star, because all young readers could relate to that. All young boys dreamt of going to the moon.
Hergé had created a brand in Tintin. His signature on the covers was as famous as Tintin's face. The Adventures of Tintin was selling millions all over the world. Although the success was well received, it meant Hergé had more pressure to mass produce. Through the decades, as Tintin's popularity had grown, Hergé was under pressure to use assistants to help with production.
When you're working on your own, which he mostly was, you can become quite obsessed. Hergé became like a brand, in the way Disney became a brand, and most people assumed that Uncle Walt did all of the drawings and all of the animations, because Hergé had a team of people under him working. And when people asked for a credit or their name mentioned on the artwork, he always flatly refused. He wanted it just to be branded Hergé.
I mean, I think clearly Hergé was a man who would like to have been left alone. All the stuff about collaboration and all of that. I think he was a man who wanted to sit in his room and draw and create these cartoons that he clearly loved so dearly.
His first collaboration dated back to King Ottokar's scepter, when he asked Edgar P. Jacobs to help with the complicated costumes and landscapes.
Jacobs' graphic work was very, very striking. The archetype of the clear line technique with a great sense of colors, especially earth colors, color schemes, you know, that wash through series of pages.
By the 1950s, Tintin was a recognized brand, and Hergé had spawned a team of artists to help produce Tintin. The art of the drawings had developed even more, making the illustrations near perfect.
The technical side of the drawing became even more perfect. I mean, tanks were an actual model of tank. I don't think he needed to. I mean, he had a perfectly a marvelous technique. Yeah, that's even his latest stories. They look wonderful, but I think he just kind of he became more involved in editing and possibly in running the business.
By the late 1950s, Hergé fell in love with Fanny Vlaminck, an assistant at his studios. He had been married since 1932 and wrestled with the idea of divorce. During this time, he repeatedly had nightmares that he said showed the beauty and cruelty of white. He eventually divorced his wife, and this difficult period and the nightmares he suffered inspired Tintin in Tibet.
Tintin!
Chang!
Thundering typhoons, Tintin.
I just had the most awful dream. It was about my friend Chang. He'd been in a plane crash and was calling out to me for help.
We find Tintin in complete anguish because he's had a dream that his old friend Chang from the Blue Lotus is dead. And so he travels out to Tibet and sets out to find him.
2 decades had passed since Hergé had made contact with his friend Chang. But life would eventually imitate art as the two were reunited in 1981.
Who's there?
Chang! Chang, you're safe!
Tintin, I knew you would come.
Tintin in Tibet, I think, is interesting, and he talks about that being his own nightmares, being a land of white, and recreating that in Tintin in Tibet.
There you have the start of the book, and the colours are European, and they're the classic colours of Tintin. And so you don't have to read a single word, you know where you are and you know who it is. But then later in the book, when he gets, to Tibet or Nepal, look at the difference. It's an icy world, it's a scary one, it's a dangerous world. The blue hints at danger.
So within that kind of haunting white snowscape of the Himalayas, we have Tintin wandering around in some emotional distress. I believe that Hergé wrote it at a time when he had just divorced his wife and was in quite a bleak place himself. And it's interesting how that is reflected in the text itself.
There's a real dignity as well to the way that the local characters are portrayed in this, I think. Here's Tintin with a local Tibetan guy, and they're kind of equals, they're similar. It's kind of showing the fact that, Tintin is like similar people like him in another part of the world. That's a massive change from the early ones in the Congo. It's almost as if Hergé is kind of trying to perhaps make up for the sins of his youth or the perceived sins of racism. That kind of shows the journey that Hergé makes, I think, as a person and as an artist.
3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles. This rock and roll group has taken over as the kingpins of musical appreciation among the younger element. Some of the fences hold, others do not. A minor miracle is mounted by the fact that there are no injuries spread among the near hysterical crowd. This truly is a social document for our time.
Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
By the 1960s, the world had changed. Pop culture and rock and roll would contest the world of comic books. Hergé's audience had evolved once more.
Young people whose main concern were the length of their hair and the guitar and scoring with the girls became more and more difficult to attract their attention.
Art and literature was also in a state of transformation, and the graphic novel was not immune to change.
Hergé knew that there would be an end to it. You couldn't keep that young chap in his blue sweater and plus fours just going around the world.
Hergé was slowing down, with his books being released less frequently. Tintin's last 3 adventures were released over 13 years.
You find quite an interesting progression as we go through the books. The first are written in the 30s, the later ones are written sort of in the 60s and 70s. But it's interesting now to come back to the books with that knowledge, and there's another level on which you can read them, I think, by looking at them through Hergé's own internal struggle and his own politics and how that changed over time.
Hergé was known for changing his stance on certain beliefs, which he showed through the eyes of Tintin. With 22 adventures produced, Hergé's journey as an author can be mapped.
He has been questioned about his politics. I think he's quite honest about it, about changing his mind in certain periods of history. You have to be open to change your opinions, and it would be hard to comment in such a broad sweep about such many countries as he did in changing times without being wrong-footed by history a few times.
Especially the 20th century, which was the most murderous century ever.
I suppose when, you know, the Germans took over the paper he was writing the comic strip for, people saw him as a collaborator, when in fact he was again just fitting into the circumstance. So, you know, Catholicism to start with, sort of the Nazis that followed next, you know, and then later on his sort of views kind of changed from sort of right to left. Because I think to say he was easily influenced makes him sound as if he was weak-minded and so on, which he isn't. He's clearly strong-minded. But assimilating other people's views and trying on other people's shoes effectively maybe gave him a different perspective.
Georges Remy, the artist best known as Hergé, died in March 1983. He had reflected a turbulent 20th century through the creation of Tintin. His early political misconceptions had been overcome, and he was awarded honours at home in Belgium and abroad.
Whether or not there are all these dramatic themes that people have drawn out in the work later, and the art and the intensity of the research, it's gateway literature, and that's one of his real strengths.
There's quite a number of artists on the continent who still use the clear line technique to do their stories. So they are the children of Hergé. So Hergé's influence is still very strong, and is part of this artistic continuum.
There's always been a degree in which kind of Tintin has sort of been on my shoulder. When I first rocked up in South America, I couldn't but think of Tintin with the picaros, or the first time I went to the Himalayas, and all that stuff. Tintin was just with me all along the ride.
Hergé's legacy lives on in the adventures of Tintin. The characters appear in film and figurines, but the books will always stay the same.